So good morning. Welcome everybody that's joined us for our third Culture Declares Emergency offer. What a day it is today. Today is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day being celebrated around the world and giving us a chance, whilst we wonder at home whether that onion will stretch to another meal, it gives us a chance to really kind of expand outwards and mark this day that probably none of us expected to be celebrating Earth Day in such a way as we are in lockdown in our own homes. But that also gives us a chance to connect in ways that we weren't necessarily expecting. My name is Lucy Neal. I'm one of the group for Culture Declares Emergency, as I think all of you are or are welcome to be. And this offer is a response to the context of the coronavirus that we're living in and the quite astonishing and devastating impact it's having in odd and unexpected, surprising and disturbing ways, and not least on the creative and cultural community itself. So this is a space for anyone that's involved or interested in our cultural response to the climate and ecological emergency, simply to be together, to question, to share, and also to support each other. So the offer happens every Wednesday morning at 11, as some of you know, till 12:30, for essentially a conversation-based session, and then again on Wednesday at 7:30 for creative and regenerative sessions. So you are absolutely welcome if you'd like to make an offer or to lead a session. Get in touch, culturedeclares@gmail.com, or of course via social media. We are recording this session, so if you'd rather not appear in a recording, then do turn off your computer video or phone camera, but still get the audio. And as we mentioned before, if you could just stay muted, but obviously when you wish to speak, then unmute yourself. It is this morning my very, very, very great delight to introduce you to our speaker for this morning, Dr Barbara Heinzen, who Julia Roundtree will introduce you to very shortly. We met Barbara in the 90s when we were involved in the London International Festival of Theatre. Barbara has got up at an exceptionally early hour, and you will see the sun's rays just beginning to come through her window. She lives on the upper Hudson River, and we'll hear about the land she's on, I dare say. But just to say really that it was in the 90s when Barbara introduced me particularly to the very idea of how we might live in ecological societies, and the very notion that societies do learn and that societies can reinvent themselves and adapt. And that's the heart of what she's going to be talking to us about. But before I hand over to Julia, I just thought we could mark together that this is Earth Day, and that there are many earth protectors that we know of. Barbara herself is one, and earth protectors who are fighting all across the world. Polly Higgins died a year ago yesterday, a great earth protector, and in the global south, and particularly in South America, where so many earth protectors are losing their lives for the earth that they're fighting to protect: water, land, sea, and air. So I just thought we would have one quiet moment together. And if you'd like to just close your eyes to take a breath, I'm just going to read a few words written by an artist in Norway called Eva Bakkeslett. Close your eyes and take deep breaths. Imagine the breath going to every part of your body. Imagine the air that has travelled continents, breathed by people through their bodies all over the world, been through mighty trees and sung by birds. Breath that has travelled in clouds and been trumpeted by elephants. Feel the power of that breath, from the first breath of life to the last. You're imbibing life itself, and you share it with every living creature on earth. So here we are connected for these moments this morning. And I'm now going to hand over to Julia Roundtree to give Barbara a little bit more welcome and introduction. Julia.
Lucy mentioned, hello everybody to begin with. Lucy mentioned the LIFT Festival. I worked at LIFT for 20 years, mainly responsible for raising commercial sponsorship. And in the early 90s, I was struggling with the ever increasing penetration of commercial values into every area of life, and puzzled about, couldn't there be another relationship that we might have with the business world, one in which they learned from us, or where culture's importance in terms of social learning and insight was valued. And in my struggle, I reached out to Brian Eno, and he responded very warmly and took me to a meeting of an organisation called Global Business Network in the basement of the Goring Hotel near Victoria. Anyway, it was there that I first came across Barbara. She was speaking about some work she'd done with the Scottish government about economic development and various scenarios that might face economic development in Scotland. And it was the first time that I came across the methodology of scenario planning, and Barbara will explain that slightly more in a minute. But I was, and Barbara is a geographer who has done a PhD at SOAS in international development and has very extensive experience in particularly East Africa and elsewhere around the world. And she sees herself primarily as a geographer, but she is a scenario planner and futures thinker. And what I came to learn from Barbara was that actually, contrary to the received wisdom at the time that economic development was king and the economy came first, that in fact, social developments precede, social foundations precede economic development in a very beautiful and elegant double S curve. So as social foundations develop, then economic development can follow, but only when the social foundations are in place. And in Barbara's research into how societies learn, she had made a study of the 14th century Black Death, not the one that preceded, or that outbreak of it that preceded the Great Fire, which we've all learned about in our history lessons. But I was electrified by this insight, because it completely overturned all the political rhetoric and policies and wisdom at the time. And it gave us a chink of hope that we might, through culture and a programme of international theatre, bring people together, in fact, across sectors, both the business and public sector, and young people and artists, to learn together about what was happening in the world. And Barbara and other scenario planners worked with us for 10 years on this programme, and we gained a lot of insights from it. But I'll hand over to Barbara now, and she can elucidate further.
So welcome, Barbara. Extremity and Invention. And everybody listening, please be thinking if there's something that you want to exchange or discuss. When Barbara has spoken, we will be in smaller groups with each other to resonate and exchange ideas, and then have a chance to broaden that question, the conversation with Barbara herself. So thank you for joining us at this early hour, Barbara. Welcome.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for even turning up to this virtual room. I'm I'm profoundly flattered and honored to be in this company. Julia talks about how much she learned from me, but it was an equal exchange. I learned a lot from working with Lyft, and it was fantastic to try and see what happens when you put unlikely people together and have a conversation about things you both experienced. In that case, it was events we'd experienced in the Business Arts Forum and performances that we would go to. So it was a very important engagement we had together. And it also became for me a place where I rehearsed ideas that were then included in a book I wrote called Feeling for Stones, where I was trying to imagine how might we, thank you, Julia, how might we invent ecological societies when we have no model to follow? And that book came out of really the double S curve that Julia was describing, which I confess came out of my desperate need for work in 1984. And I met people at Shell and they said, please predict the next newly industrializing countries based on their cultural characteristics. And I thought this was a horrid, slightly racist Time magazine question, but I said, what a good idea, which just tells you how desperate you can get during a recession. And anyway, I found some wonderful statistics and people who showed me that, in fact, when a population was healthy and well educated, rapid economic growth would often follow. And not just a minority of the population, but the whole population. So that got me started on thinking, what is the nature of social and economic change? How do those things work together? And I won't elaborate that much, although the curve itself comes back in the last slide I'm going to show you. But the other thing that that study in 1984 showed me was that there were a number of countries moving up the development ladder, and that they were going to put increasing strain on the natural resources and on the social, political, and geopolitical framework we'd been using since the Second World War. So that's when I started thinking about what would it take when we start addressing the challenge that was putting on our natural systems. And in writing the book, I ended up, because around the same time I started working with Lyft, I also started working in East Africa with the Society for International Development. And there I was asked to work with people in Kenya in the first instance to help them imagine different futures for Kenya. And I was using techniques that I had learned at Shell, where they had, at the time, something like 35 people trying to imagine what would the future of the world be like. Not just in the next couple of years, but over 20 or 30, sometimes 50-year timeframes. An oil company invests for the very long term. How do they know their money will not be wasted? And how do they test whether the investment will be sound for that long period of time? And so they started in the 1970s imagining different futures, and they would tell stories about the future of the global economy and society and political frameworks, and saying, well, what might it be like? Will it be like story A, story B, story C? And anybody who had to make an investment had to say, my investment will still succeed in each of these different futures. So it had very real practical business application. And I learned that technique, and I worked with business in the late 80s, early 90s, and then in the mid 90s, I started working in East Africa. So when I was thinking about ecological societies, I ended up having really three different questions that I was thinking about. One was, how did England, and it did start in England, invent the Industrial Revolution when they didn't know it was there to be invented? I thought that gave us a parallel to what we were experiencing or would be experiencing in trying to invent ecological societies. And that's what I'm going to focus on this morning. Second, could you see in the early English history that social foundations also preceded economic development in that history of pre-industrial England? Third, what would have been are what might be the lessons we can pick up from African societies who have had some of the greatest biodiversity in the world until Europeans decided to help them develop and become even more, become as rapacious as we are in terms of using our natural resources. So I took those three things and created the book that Julia was showing you, which remarkably nobody wanted to publish when I finished it in 2003. I think the mixture of topics, where do you put it on the bookshelf, the question, they were pretty irrelevant to most publishers. And I ended up printing about 500 copies myself, of which there's still 25 copies sitting in a print shop in Clerkenwell, so, which was my home base. And that book led in a lot of new directions, but that's another story and I'm not going to labor that with you. So let me turn over to my presentation. And I think, Holly, I need to share screen by now. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Okay. So Julia very brilliantly came up with this title, and it's absolutely accurate. And what I wanted to go over with you, these slides were actually developed when I was working with LIFT. And LIFT, because we were trying to summarize this very complex thinking about what pre-industrial England was like, forced me to summarize it with these triple E's. What drove invention in England? Well, it was extremity and necessity. A social system that valued experiment and education, and where people engaged with each other across social boundaries, and even aesthetics, which was the inside of the LIFT work, were important in helping social dialogue. So these are the three things I'm going to describe and go over with you. And Newton's windmill is very much a part of that, but I'll tell you that story as we go on. So let me start with extremity, because it was the, people have been wondering to what extent is our current pandemic anything like, or are there any lessons we can learn from the other pandemics we've experienced in history? And in the searching for an environmental driver of industrial development in England, I ended up going back to the time of the Norman conquest. And what the history books were telling me was that from 1100 to 1200 to 1300, you had 200 years of an exceptional absence of disease, a little bit like the last 50 years we've had in the world today, since the Second World War, that's more than 50 years. We've had an exceptional absence of disease. In our case, it's because of the improvements in sanitation and vaccines. But in that case, it was just an accident of ecology, I think. You also had, in those 200 years, a growing international trade. And you had, in England, the increasing, not the increasing, but the start of the use of coal for fuel. Because in those 200 years, the population, according to the estimates I was reading at the time, went from 2 million in about 1100 to 6 million by 1300. And we colonized all of the available space that mankind could colonize in England by 1300. And that meant that by that date, we were reaching the limits of what we could produce agriculturally, and we were reaching the limits of wood fuel, which is why in the 13th century, you start seeing names like Seacoal Lane and Limeburner Lane, which are streets you can still find in the city of London, just off Farringdon, which is where sea coal would be landed. And then what is completely, the metaphor, if not a complete analogy, is so fascinating, is that around 1300, climate changes and the weather starts to get colder. Agriculture starts to fail. People are going hungry, there's more disease, and in 1348, the absolute horror of the Black Death comes to England. And a year later, it goes into Scotland. Animals are dying even before the Black Death, in something called a murrain, a big dying. And remember, this is when we had no scientific explanations for what was happening. So it was a very horrific and horrid time for people. Yesterday afternoon, I was reading this book, A Distant Mirror, and the descriptions there of the Black Death are just astonishing. Bodies piling up, people coming to a place and dying before they woke up the next morning. So what was the, what followed from that? And there are a number of things, but what was particularly interesting to me was that the population did not reach its peak of 6 million for another 450 years. And it only came back to that 6 million in about 1750, which is the date many historians identify as the start of the Industrial Revolution. So that period from 1300 to 1750 was the period when the social foundations, if my thesis was right, would have been laid down. And I wanted to find out, well, what was going on in that time period? What happened? The Black Death had another consequence, of course, is that one of the reasons the population stayed low was that I think people were frightened by what happened. And it became customary not to marry until you could support a family. So many people didn't marry at all. 15 to 25% of peers' daughters never married, 15 to 20% of peers' sons never married, and 9% of women under the age of 30 were unmarried. So people didn't marry. The population was also kept down by pandemics and epidemics that continued to hit the population on a regular basis. And of course that meant, and it first started with the Black Death, that labor was scarce. And because labor was scarce, the landowners ran sheep because they didn't have any arable, they didn't have any people to plow the crops. So sheep were a low labor way of keeping the land productive, and it earned quite a good price on different markets. That funny little object that just flew in from the left is my simple attempt to create a cannon. Because the other thing that was happening was that monarchs continued to go to war because monarchs are vain, they like more territory, and they fight about it. And they needed cannons, and cannons were quite they were the innovation of the time, but they needed iron, and the iron needed to be smelted. And the only thing that really produced good quality iron was charcoal. Coal wasn't good enough. It pitted the iron and it made the cannons blow up. So if you shot a cannonball at somebody, you'd be likely to have all the shrapnel in your face, which was not really a desirable outcome. So cannons were also an important factor because they used charcoal. And what did the charcoal do? It used up wood. So you still had the energy puzzle for all this time. People didn't know where their energy was going to come from. And in that period, you see coal gradually replacing charcoal in one industry after another. So this is a history where you have the extremity of the Black Death, shaking up the existing order in all sorts of ways, lowering the population, and a very slow recovery of the population, which was very small, so people could engage with each other on terms that were pretty intimate. And at the same time, you had the continuing necessity of how are we going to heat our homes, cook our food, and produce the things we need. So it's, the environmental drivers were there in the absence of wood fuel and in the episode of epidemics, which to me are an ecological crisis as much as anything else. At least that's the way I see it. So what happened after that? And this brings us to our second E. If the first one is extremity and necessity, the second E is education and experiments. And one of the things that I found fascinating was that in developing countries in the post-war period, those that increased education for the whole population were the ones that developed the manufacturing, high-growth industries of the subsequent decades. So were there educational foundations in early England? And in 1100 to 1200, you have the founding of secular public schools. And these were schools that were open to anyone. They were not attached to any church or monastery. They were schools that a locality might decide to open because they needed more clerks, and they needed the clerks to record transactions of land. And so literacy and reading were reading and writing as a skill were being slowly expanded through the population, and were not just a feature of those who had an elite tutorial education. And about 100 years after you get the schools, you also get the universities, which was an idea picked up from the European universities in Italy and France. And those are brought to Oxford and Cambridge. You have the whole start of that. And what's interesting is that a large number of the people who went there were not just elites. They were often, up until 1800, they were often people who came from fairly modest backgrounds. So it wasn't a preserve of elite people for much of this period up to 1750. And then the third social foundation that began even before the Black Death. And these were small experiments. These were just people like us getting together and saying, oh, let's try to have a discussion. The other thing that happened in universities was that they brought the pattern, the style of learning called, that was much more like the Oxbridge tutorial, lectio et quaestio, read and question, hear and question. So you had a dialogue of exploration and a use of logic to try and understand complex phenomena. So it's a new style of thinking. You were not having to accept the dictates of the dogma of the church. You could question things and explore where those questions might lead. So that was an important foundation. Finally, you have Parliament, which expanded its powers particularly between 1200 and 1400. And that was largely because the good old canon, the monarchs continued to need money for their wars. And they had to ask the commons for the money because the great landed estates were not producing enough. And one of the really fascinating things about the Black Death, which was that people began almost immediately asking for higher wages. But the political consequences were kind of delayed. And 30 years later, roughly, you have the king saying, please give me more money. And the Commons meets in the chapter house across the road in Westminster Abbey. And they say, nobody's going to leave this room until we all agree on what we're going to say. And they told the king, no money. We're not going to give you money until you impeach those ministers that have been abusing our trust and misusing our funds. So impeachment became a feature of the English Constitution about 30 years after the Black Death. And the Commons at the time said, you have to understand we're suffering from this pestilence of servants who keep asking for more money. How can we give our money to you? This pestilence of servants. And when the king said, well, who are these, John of Gaunt said, who are these lowly knights? He said, they're men strong in arms, be careful. So you had a readjustment of power at the elite level. And in 1381, you had Wat Tyler and his rebels storming into London, beheading the king's treasurer in my neighborhood of Clerkenwell, burning down the gate. And eventually Wat Tyler on a horse met with young King Richard and said, here is my list of demands. And what's interesting to me about that is that his list was a written list. So he knew how to read. And when he and his rebels went into towns in the southeast of England, many of them could read, and they went into the local records of who was a villain, who was obliged to serve on a landed estate. They went into the records, they found the rolls that defined who was a villain and who was not. They put them in the town square and they burnt them. So they were grabbing their freedom from what had been not quite a slavery, but a very captive relationship with overlords. So that was a consequence of the Black Death. To me, the real significance of the Black Death was the way it shook up power. And the repeated epidemics meant that there's a high mortality in the elites. So when that was allied to primogeniture, the elites were constantly churning. You had a changeover of elites on an irregular and unpredictable basis. But the importance of this period is that if you look at how it relates to the timeline of population, these experiments in knowledge and education and political agreement started before the Black Death. And I think many, when we were talking about these subjects in LIFT, we were saying, well, what are the experiments we're starting now that might help us survive and regroup after whatever crisis we might be facing? And these were two very strong foundations, which is how do we talk to each other? How do we come to agreements? And what's our knowledge and what's our style of learning? And I think today you can see new concepts coming in. You can see experiments in different ways of talking to each other. They're tiny, they don't always work, but they're beginning. The work we're doing in Africa, we call the politics of learning. So there are these tiny experiments around us all over the place. So experiment and education is my second big need. Third, and this is where I think I owe a huge debt to LIFT, because what we were doing with the Business Arts Forum was trying to engage people across the boundaries of our society in London that aren't normally crossed. So by Julia bringing together people from the arts, from government, from business, to attend different LIFT performances and then say, what did we see, what did we learn? We were creating a different style of dialogue in the context of our London society in the 1990s and early 2000s. And this turned out to be also a very strong feature of that period up to 1750 and afterwards. And what exemplified it for me more than anything was a story I read in the biography of Newton, where he was a schoolboy in Grantham, and Grantham was too far away to take advantage of the coal. They couldn't get there by cart. There's no canal to move it. So people started to build a windmill. And they heard about windmills, which were the big new technology of the time, from somebody who's in correspondence with people, presumably in the Netherlands, saying, hey, here's a new source of power. Maybe we can use this to give ourselves a form of energy. And every Sunday, people would go out to the edge of town and look at this new construction being built. And Newton would, I assume, go out with everybody else and watch it being built. He was so fascinated by this windmill and the mechanics of it that he then made a scale model. There was an exact replica of what was being built on the edge of town. And what I find interesting is that for this windmill to have been built, it would have needed someone in town to have the knowledge and the links with other societies to bring in new knowledge. It would have needed somebody to come up with the funds, because the king didn't bother to fund local government. One of the books I read said, local government at the king's command. So you pretty much were left on your own to do whatever you needed to do. So someone locally had to come up with the money, someone had to come up with the designs, and you needed the craftsmanship and the knowledge of hands. So you had intellect, finance, and practical skills all coming together to meet an immediate neighborly need. And you were crossing social boundaries by putting this windmill together. So it's what we started thinking of as intimacy and diversity over the long term, working project by project, created the engagement that was a critical feature of the creative society England was in that run up to 1750. The fact that you had the commons meant that some of the local elites were also moving to London on a regular basis to attend Parliament, The season, I'm sure, was also part of that. So you had a dialogue between country and town that was also a very important feature. You had gentleman and yeoman. And these are two words that became common words by 1400, after the Black Death. Before the Black Death, you had a highly stratified, highly rigid society. After the Black Death and the drop in population back to about 2 million, you just had two words, gentleman and yeoman. You had this kind of simplification of the social structure. You also had playwrights and I can't see what that is over there. Merchants, yeah. You had different kinds of people in pretty close proximity to each other. And I find it fascinating that even before you had the English Civil War, when poor old Charles lost his head, you had Shakespeare writing plays on when is it legitimate to depose a monarch. And so people were rehearsing these important ideas in the plays of Shakespeare's time. So you had culture creating a space to debate complex dilemmas that society was facing. And finally, where's my finally? Come on, you can do it. Yeah, you had people working together, guildsmen and farmers. One of the other features of society was that because people married late and ordinarily you might pass on your livelihood to your eldest, it meant the other children in the family had to find another place to go. And they would they would be apprenticed to other places. They would roam around for a while trying this occupation or that occupation, and eventually they would settle someplace, raise their family, and contribute to local society. But they would have been exposed to a wider social experience by apprenticeship in another place or going to work in a household somewhere. So you had this mixture of intimacy and also openness to experience in other parts of English society. And you also had people traveling abroad to a certain extent. So the engagement was a really important part of creative society, and the aesthetics of where the arts and culture were contributing was also part of that. So all of that was just a really interesting feature, and it was immediately relevant to what we were doing at LIFT. So those are, come on, right, my 3 E's: extremity and necessity. And we can't overlook the necessity of finding a new fuel. Experiment and education, and particularly the combination of elite questioning, the university style of learning, and the popular ability to read and write, which was expanding throughout this period. And secondly, the engagement in an intimate setting, solving immediate problems across social boundaries, with the role that aesthetics was playing, the culture was playing in debating complex ideas and dilemmas. So those are the 3 drivers of invention that I identified in looking at the history of pre-industrial England. And it's a little bit fluffy, a little bit idealized, but it gives us a kind of framework for thinking about where we are now. And that brings me back to where we started, which is the great double S curve. And what the double S curve showed us was that the social foundations, you see this slide is so old, I didn't know how to do a curve very well, would develop very gradually. They start flat, but then as life expectation improved, literacy improved, more people could read, knowledge improved, life expectation improved. So you had this gradual improvement of health and education. This is in developing countries in the late 20th century. But the economy only really got going once you had most people healthy and well educated. If you look at the very top of that dotted curve, that's when you see the rapid increase in economic activity. And that was the pattern we saw in the newly industrializing countries of Asia. What's interesting is that I would also find in the record in 1984 when I was developing this thinking, that there are countries that grew very rapidly, but they did not have strong social foundations. And those were the countries that were extracting natural resources. So they substituted the extraction and exploitation of natural resources for creating strong social foundations. And that's where you get these very unequal societies like Angola, or some of the great oil extractors. Nigeria is one of them. And so you have this, and you have the elites capturing the wealth, using it for their own benefit, and you don't have the strong foundations developing. So all this looked fantastic, and it meant that people around the world were getting a higher standard of living, but population was growing. We had better knowledge about how to feed people, how to control disease. That's fantastic. But you could also see that local and global ecosystems are finite, they're dynamic, and they're not going to take this lightly. The natural world has its own logic, and we haven't learned to live with it lately. In fact, we've been pretending it doesn't matter. But certainly, Katrina was where my father, who'd been looking at geology as in retirement, said, I guess I have to change my mind about global warming. And suddenly the natural world was no longer just allowing us to get away with whatever we wanted. So that to me was one of the first shocks that you could see where we were colliding with the limits of the natural system. And that to me also suggests that we need to have a second double S curve where we need to create the social foundations for ecological societies to create a different economy that's based on restoring and supporting ecosystems rather than simply supporting human societies and human production. And I find myself looking for, where are the experiments today? What's the knowledge that's building up? What kind of knowledge is it? How widespread is it? Who is acquiring it? And how are we going to get through this transition from the logic of the industrial development, which was a logic of extraction, to a logic of restoration and care? And that has all kinds of implications for how we manage disease, how we manage consumption, how we manage production, and what we value and what we're willing to pay for, since the price signal is what we're using to guide our societies now. It also has implications for property rights, which were one of the things that changed for industrial development to happen. And I suspect we'll have equally massive changes in the legal structure and the ownership structure in our societies, the way finance works. Every piece of our social infrastructure, of our knowledge infrastructure, of our physical infrastructure will be changing in order to develop this ecological revolution. If we go back to the calamitous extremity slide, I think that we're likely to be facing an equally hard century as the one that hit Europe and early England between 1300 and 1400. I think we have to look at what experiments we have now. A lot of disasters hit at that time, a lot of craziness, a lot of violence. I was reading yesterday that Jewish populations were wiped out during the Black Death in any number of European cities because, of course, Jews were the obvious cause of all the troubles. And you need to have a good scapegoat, and there they are, handy as ever. So, where are we in this? And I think we're going to be facing a time that's going to be even more difficult, and that the COVID-19 epidemic is the beginning of this. It's the first time I think it's coming home to people at a much more granular level. It's no longer just a few of us saying, oh yeah, I can see it starting. Katrina was New Orleans, that's too many Black folks, that doesn't matter. This is affecting a much wider population. But this is, I think, where we're facing. This is where we're heading. And the creativity that we develop at this time, the kind of cultural norms that we develop at this time are especially important, particularly because we're in that funny little transition. where we don't know which system is going to guide us. And of course, there's going to be a lot of conflict because people who have benefited from the Industrial Revolution are going to be saying, hang on, you can't just destroy me like that. How are we going to negotiate that? And what will be the cultural norms that emerge from this period? I think that's about all I have to say. So over to Lucy and Polly for whatever happens now.
Well, Barbara, we will break, but actually I think it would be fascinating for people just to know where you are.
Oh, yes. Shall I show me?
And also your project there.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Just briefly.
All right. Let's see. I'm afraid the sun did not come out, but that's the Hudson River. You're looking at a wetland and swamp forest on the boundaries, the western shore of the Hudson River. And I came here because writing that book was really a mistake. It forced me to change all sorts of things. It didn't force me, but I decided to change all sorts of things. And one of the things that came out of the book and working in East Africa was that several of us started an experiment where we said, we have the kind of engagement across cultures in East Africa that's similar to what you could see in early England. And there's a whole colonial story to the early English story, but I won't bore you with that. So why can't we create an experiment where we learn from African and Western societies on equal terms to understand how we might create the new institutions and the new norms of an ecological society? And there are now about 8 to 10 of us, and each of us has a learning site. There's one in Cornwall. My friend has a farm there. There's my place here on the Hudson River, and there's about 6 or 8 sites in East Africa where we're using our own property and our own communities to test new ways of managing land and new agreements that might help us restore and support the natural world. We call it the Barbet's Duet because barbets are tropical birds that sing in duet. And so we wanted to get across that idea of the duet of cultures that engage with each other in a fruitful and constructive way. And when my parents died, I decided to use my inheritance, which we have to thank the booming property market of suburban New York for that, in 2006, just before the crash. And I bought this place, which is close to family, and it's a riparian site with high biodiversity. So a friend and I are learning to manage it to push out the invasives, increase the animals and plants and birds that are supported here. And we're trying to figure out how to do that while having no money to afford it. So this man who's helping me came because he wanted to hunt on my property. And I said, you can hunt, but in return, you have to give me land management. And that's turned out to be an engagement between somebody from a very strong Trump supporting, not quite Trump supporting, but classic working class Republican background, and myself as a globalist, elitist from London. And we're working together in a very fruitful and creative way, partly because he's an amazing man and we have just a very solid understanding of what we're doing. He said at one point, I didn't realize how much I'd learned as a hunter until I started working here. So it's his knowledge of the natural world, and he's a fantastically good naturalist, and whatever I bring, it's creating a really interesting example of exactly the kind of engagement Lift and I were exploring whenever it was, 20 years ago. So that's the project that brought me here. And I miss London enormously. I can't tell you how homesick I am on a regular basis.
Well, thank you, Barbara, very much indeed. And it's our job individually and collectively to reflect and wonder what our own role is as a creative response to the climate and ecological emergency. That's what brings us together. If there are questions, because I'm sorry, but there's absolutely no way I can get to see you all. If you want to just put in the chat a question that has come up for you or for your group, The one that I was in made a note that, as a point that Shelley raised about how Barbara pointed out about education, was sort of based on sort of read and question, or hear and question, and how incredibly useful that would be for us at the moment to societally be able to be, you know, predominantly asking questions, but also to be listening and engaging in that sort of sense of inquiry. Okay, so Barbara, how are you? You were in a breakout room, weren't you? I can't quite see where you are in this great.
I was, but before I go any further, is my fan causing problems? Because I'll switch to a headset.
It comes and goes a little, Barbara. Sometimes it's a bit more predominant. Could people raise their hand if they're finding the slight whirring noise that underlies Barbara's voice on occasion? Or are people, is that disturbing you?
I'll switch, just give me a minute.
This is where Barbara goes into air traffic control mode and finds her earphones. So Barbara, I'm going to just, somebody's being asked to add a question. Heather's saying, Amanda, could you write your question? So Amanda, we look forward to that.
Okay, is that better?
Well, we don't get the computer fan, so that's fine. We can hear you. Everyone can hear Barbara. Can they hear Barbara? Say something, Barbara. Yes. Yes.
Oh yeah, that's true. I have to speak. Okay, good. Sorry about that.
So here is asked a really straightforward question, actually, which I think we can answer quite easily, which is, can people have a copy of the slides, Barbara? Yes?
Yes, of course.
That's quite easy.
Yeah.
So we've got two questions running at the moment, Barbara. One is from Perry, who I think you know of old. Have you seen any post-virus scenarios as yet?
Yes, I have seen them, and for some reason my ears aren't working very well, but never mind. I haven't seen them. I see them coming out. I get the Financial Times and I see them, people all the time are saying, well, what follows next? What will follow next? And in the scenario planning world, one of the things we do is say, what are going to be the big drivers of change? And it strikes me that one of the big drivers right now is that we're spending vast amounts of money to control this epidemic, and we don't even know whether it's going to be controlled. So what's going to happen to that deficit, and how will governments make up? Where will they get the income to pay off the debts they're incurring? So one of my hopeful notions is that they'll start putting in a carbon price, so in order to get money into government coffers in order to pay off the debt of coping with this pandemic. That gets back to how loud will the voices be that say, no, you have to continue to support the petroleum industry. And Trump's been notable for his help to propping up the oil price, and distinctly lacking in his help to anything else, as far as I can tell. So that's one possibility. Whether people are going to learn cooperation or whether we're going to learn more aggression, I think the vote's a bit out on that, particularly in this country where, again, we have forces trying to not isolate, but radicalize and divide people rather than bringing them together. But then also you've had events like this where people are coming together. Mm-hmm. I think when I listen to the British news and the American news, you have a much stronger set of collective responses than we have in the States, for example. We've had nothing like the outpouring of support for the NHS that I've seen in Britain over here, because what would we want to give money to all these private corporations that now run our hospitals? Because
Barbara, you've frozen a little, so I might whilst we wait for you to thaw or whatever needs to happen.
Okay, I don't know what does need to happen.
No, that's fine. You're back. You're back.
Okay.
And forgive me because I hadn't had this idea when I spoke your question for you. But if we now move on to Amanda's question, Amanda, would you like to ask that directly? Because you should all be able to speak. It's just the limits of time.
Okay, and the limits of the broadband, which is why I wasn't sure. Is everyone picking me up okay? Because
yes, we are, Amanda. Welcome.
I'm not sure if my broadband's giving me that. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about how the examples of history are in part due to the Black Death and also impacted by colonialism and gender oppression. And rather than kind of work out the category of need, it would be helpful to think of it about in terms of otherness. So how do we avoid falling into the same traps of having a heteronormative dominant group leading and shaping our future? That's the first question. And the second question was about, given the learning that you've shared with us so fantastically, how do we activate change?
How do we activate?
How do we activate the change that we need to make, the changes that you've outlined that came? How do we activate that? I'm relieved that my broadband allowed me to say all that.
And Barbara,
yeah.
Amanda's written in the chat. So how do we avoid the normative dominancy that we've seen in the past in our histories? And how do we activate change? How do we activate change given what we can learn from history? Thank you, Amanda, and the group that you were in.
Yeah, I think avoiding the normative changes is really it's really hard. It's really who you invite into the room. That's the first. Who are you talking to? And that's one part of it. I was also listening to a talk yesterday from someone in South Africa. It was actually a webinar on human rights and a right to a clean environment, a healthy environment. But she was saying it's not enough to talk about human rights. You have to talk about justice. And she said often it means that those of us who've been used to speaking all the time have to learn to shut up. And we also have to learn to listen. And we're not very good at that. So it's, first of all, you have to have the voices within range of each other. And you have to learn how to shut up from my side as part of the dominant culture. And you also have to learn to speak up. I was struck when I was working with Singapore Airlines that a lot of the Chinese guys, when we were doing scenario conversations, would just stay stumm. They wouldn't say anything, partly because they're afraid of getting slapped if they said the wrong thing or they appear stupid. Whereas when I was doing scenario work in East Africa, I was the only non-East African in the room. And we made a point of not inviting any donors in the room. Even though they paid for the project, they weren't allowed in the conversation, so that we could develop a strong East African voice, or a Kenyan voice, or Ugandan voice, before the normal structures of change the conversation. So you actually have to look at the structure of the invitation to the conversation. That's one thing. And then people have to learn the skills of shutting up and speaking up. Those are the things that I can think of off the top of my hat. And it comes down to an equality of respect. And often we take these things in so implicitly that we forget how we have to unlearn them. But I think this is where the arts have a really important role, because you're kind of a free space for a lot of things.
Amanda, is there anything you want to come back with from your group in terms of the question?
I think ask the others in the group, perhaps. Yeah, lots of things come up for me, but yeah, I think because the point about the colonialism wasn't mine. Yeah, it was in the group. Can't find them. Too many people.
I mean,
yeah, so if anyone wants to chime in from the group.
I mean, I trust every question asked this morning is the beginning of something which
maybe Chris,
the offer continue to be looking at.
Well, I think Pippa from Australia would have probably more insight into this. She might have some good responses to this. We're talking about it in our small group.
If it's okay, we might try to add in 2 more questions.
Yep.
One is from Sarah. Sarah, would you like to voice your question? And then I'm also going to ask another Sarah, Sarah Thomas, who's put something in chat, just to read those 2 questions out, and then we'll weave something from those 2. Sarah Deco.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I was just interested in the kind of religious philosophical views of society and how they changed following that experience of the Black Death and how that affected what happened next. I suppose I'm sort of thinking now of, you know, a sort of transition into a different kind of story, a different understanding or cosmology of ourselves in relation to everything else, and whether that happened after the Black Death and how it affected things.
Okay, thank you. Barbara, I'm just going to ask Sarah Thomas
Yep.
to read or to say hers. Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
We were talking about inequality and inequality of you know, how knowledge is produced and disseminated, but inequality in society as well. So we were wondering what a model of education might look like that was both free in the sense of accessible to all, but also free in the sense of that inquiry itself was something that came both from the body and the mind, and was really situated in the place that you were in, so that people from all backgrounds could participate in that conversation of what knowledge actually was. So yeah, we're just interested in your ideas about what a model of education might look like for our times moving forward that didn't replicate the inequalities.
Yeah. On the philosophical point, one of the things I was reading last night was that at the height of the Black Death, there's a whole group that came together, flagellants and penitents who were wandering around. And the author was saying that a lot of this was very much an anti-clerical movement, that people didn't like the dominance of the clergy, and this was really sort of setting up an alternative authority. As the epidemic waned, the authorities reasserted themselves and said, enough of this kind of, you know, ideological rebellion. We still are the ones in charge. So that kind of got damped down. But the author went on to say that having learned to question authority and as it were learning how not to be submissive, that opened the way just for an ability to think differently about the world people were facing. So I thought that was an interesting insight into that situation. Whether we get something like that now, we don't have the same sort of authoritarian structure now that we do then. If anything, we need almost more consensus about what's happening rather than less consensus. So that's a different challenge I think we're facing at the moment. On the question of what kind of education, one of the things that to me I think is really important is that we've made, and literacy was so critical, and theories have been so important, and hypothesis testing, we've overlearned the lessons of our educational system that has been so useful to the Industrial Revolution. We've forgotten how to walk and think in 3 dimensions. So one of the real pleasures of being in this place is learning to walk through these acres, it's about 20 acres of land, and learning the names of the plants and how they behave over the seasons. So it's and when I work with Eric, who's living downstairs, I find that he has to teach me to read the tracks in the mud. And his knowledge is very much a three-dimensional, hands-on, practical knowledge. He knows how to sit still and watch, because that's what he did as a hunter. I don't know how to sit still. If there's thinking work to be done, I have to go out, you know, if I have to find what's the right species to plant, that's me hours on the computer looking through different species and whether they're good for this environment. So I'm using all my book learning. But when it comes to clearing the field and how much do we plant, you know, how much do we clear, how much do we do, it's Eric who tends to take the lead. So we have this mixture here that we're practicing. I don't know how much we're sharing it, but it's how do you learn to think in 3 dimensions, not just in the 2 that you have on a printed page or on a screen. So to me, part of what the new educational system has to do is get people out of the classroom, off the screens, and start feeling the difference between a fuzzy leaf and a smooth leaf, or whatever else it is, a clay soil and a sandy soil, you know.
Barbara, thank you. I'm now in this very difficult situation of between us having opened up some of the most important questions that we're looking at now in terms of how we reinvent our societies without bringing the oppressive, the grids of oppression that have kept society unequal and unjust for so long, and not least not listening ecologically to the earth on this Earth Day today, with just a few more minutes to go. So yeah. I in a sense must begin to round up and maybe use something that Sarah's just put in, which was this idea of active listening, and that to be humble to understand how much more there is for us all to be educated in. And Pippa, I mean, you can read what people have been putting here about the decolonization and Pippa's comment in Australia. I would suggest that the offer, I hope, is a place where all these can be picked up, and we can have a chance to listen to each other and engage with these questions about how we reinvent and adapt to create a world that is just and recovering and restoring in the way that we would all wish it to in our heart of hearts. So I think with 2 minutes to go, forgive me for closing down, but I know that you all have lives and need to get on with them. So thank you all for participating. I hope you can all go out and stand and look at a leaf or a tree or some growing part of this earth that we're all part of, and need to work out how we share it and live on it fairly and restore it. So thank you very much for joining. And we hope to see each and every one of you again. And to Barbara, please go and lie down and have some breakfast. It's still only sort of 7 in the morning for you.
Yes, we're getting there.
So goodbye and thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks to everyone.
Cheerio.